Welcome to Everything Economics. We study microeconomics, macroeconomics, and every other type of economics.
Hello everyone, welcome back. So in this part, I'm going to talk about different type of demand curves. So economists classify demand curves according to their elasticity. The price elasticity of demand is closely related to the slope of the demand curve. The rule of thumb, the flatter the curve, the bigger the elasticity. The steeper the curve, the smaller the elasticity. And the next 5 slides will present different classifications from least to most elastic. So the main idea behind this lecture is that you should be able to understand how to represent elastic and inelastic demand curves on a graph. So for example, here we have two important concepts, the flatter the curve or the steeper the curve. So if I'm talking about flatter curve, here I'm talking about a demand curve which is flat like this. And when we talk about the steeper curve, I'm talking about the demand curve which basically is steep like this. So in this case, the elasticity is bigger. In the steeper case, the elasticity is smaller. So I'm going to talk about this in much more detail in the next few slides.
So let's see. Here we are talking about an extreme case. Extreme case means that this is not normal. It's a very unusual case. But in economics, we study all type of cases. The unusual ones, the extreme ones, the normal ones, every kind. So here we have perfectly inelastic demand. We are talking about, I discussed about elastic and inelastic demand before. Elastic demand is when the percentage change in quantity demanded is huge, when price level is changed. And inelastic is when the demand doesn't change much whenever the price level is changed. We talked about insulin, which was inelastic, and bouncy balls, the demand for which was elastic. Here we have the formula, price elasticity of demand is equal to percentage change in quantity over percentage change in price. It's the same. And now let's see the graph. The price level is P1, which is decreased to P2, but the quantity doesn't change at all. The quantity remains the same. So Q changes by 0% when P falls by 10%. So there is a decrease in the price level of this good by 10%, but the quantity doesn't change at all, right? So the price level is decreased, but the quantity has remained same. The consumers have not increased their consumption of this good. In this case, this is perfectly inelastic. The demand has not changed at all. Its Q has changed by only 0%. This means it's perfectly inelastic. So in this case, the demand curve is always vertical, like this. It's vertical. Consumers' price sensitivity is 0. Elasticity, as you can see here, the formula, 0% is change in quantity and 10% is change in price. 0 over 10 is equal to 0. So elasticity is also 0. This is the first case, perfectly inelastic demand. Now let's move on to the second case, inelastic demand. So here again we have the same formula, and we have a new graph, and we will find out what inelastic demand is. So the price has fallen by 10% from P1 to P2. That's a decrease of 10%. And due to that, the quantity has increased by 10%. So the Q rises by less than 10%, sorry. So you see, this distance is greater than this distance. So the price has decreased by 10%, the quantity has increased, but it has increased by less than 10%. So in this case, when you look at the formula right here, the change in quantity is less than 10% over 10%, so the final answer would always be less than 1. Whenever you apply the formula and you get the answer less than 1, between 0 and 1, let's say, then it is always inelastic demand. The demand curve in this case is relatively steep, consumers' price sensitivity is relatively low, and elasticity is less than 1. This is the second case of inelastic demand. In elastic demand, the elasticity is always between 0 and 1. Always. Now, let's move on to the third case. This is unit elastic demand. Everything is same. We have a new graph right here. So let's see how the price and quantity changes. The price level has decreased by 10% as before, but in this case the curve is more steep. More flat. It's flatter than before. So now the quantity has also increased by 10%. So this distance and this distance is equal. Price has decreased by 10% and quantity has also increased by exactly 10%. So in the formula, when we use this, we get 10% over 10% is equal to 1. So whenever price elasticity of demand is 1, you call it unit elastic demand. The price elasticity is always 1 in this case. The demand curve has intermediate slope. Consumers' price sensitivity is also intermediate, and elasticity is 1. This is the third case where the price elasticity is 1. We call it unit elastic demand. Alright, the fourth concept is elastic demand. In this case, everything else is same. We have a new graph. Here, as you can see, the demand curve is much more flatter than before. So in this case, the price has decreased by again 10%. But as you can see, the quantity, as price decreases from P1 to P2, the quantity has increased from Q1 to Q2. This distance is greater than this distance. So Q rises more than 10%. The Q has increased by more than 10%. Price has fallen by less than 10%, falls by 10%, and quantity has increased by more than 10%. So in this case, when we use this in the formula, percentage change in quantity is greater than 10%, percentage change in price is equal to 10%, and the final answer would always be greater than 1. So whenever price elasticity of demand is greater than 1, we call it elastic demand. So here in these cases, the demand curve is relatively flat, as you can see in the graph. Consumer price sensitivity is relatively high, and elasticity is greater than 1. The other extreme case is perfectly elastic demand. So in this case, the demand is perfectly elastic. The setting is same, but we have a new graph. Here, the price changes by 0%. The demand curve is flat, so whatever the case, the price doesn't change at all. But the quantity changes by any percent. The quantity can change by any percent. You can increase from Q1 to Q2, or from Q1 to Q3, or from Q1 to backward Q4. It can increase or decrease by any percent. That's why when you use it in the formula, any percent over 0%, you get infinity. So this is another case. In the other extreme case, as you can see, the demand curve, it's flat. It's going on the right side on x-axis and going to infinity. So here in this case, whenever we are talking about perfectly elastic demand, the demand curve is horizontal, consumers' price sensitivity is extreme, and elasticity is infinity. So that's it for this part. We discussed 5 different types of demand curves. It depends on the slope of the demand curve, what kind of a demand curve it is. So we discussed, let's go back. We discussed the perfectly inelastic demand curve, inelastic demand curve where it was between 0 and 1, unit elastic demand where the elasticity was 1, elastic demand where the elasticity was greater than 1, and finally perfectly elastic demand where which is the other extreme where the elasticity is infinite. So that's it for this part. See you guys in the next part. Goodbye.